It's like that today, and it was like that in prehistory. Geopolitics can have a very bad effect on the health of ordinary people. That's particularly true when superpowers collide and drag smaller nations into quarrels in which they originally had no part whatever. Hello, I'm David Beeson. Welcome to Chapter 8 of A History of Spain, entitled Superpower Clash. Now, we've already met two superpowers of the Western Mediterranean in the first millennium BCE, which heavily influenced life and culture in Iberia. They were Greece and Phoenicia. Now, as we approach the end of that millennium, we're going to find them fading away while two rising new superpowers take their places. The Greeks had fallen out amongst themselves. As Athens grew in wealth and authority, the established regional power, Sparta, began to wonder whether it needed to take seriously the threat posed by these new kids on the block. There's been much talk recently of what's come to be known as the Thucydides trap. This is the idea that the rising power of one state threatens an established one, leading, almost inevitably, to war between them. Today, the notion is applied to the competition between the US and China. The historical figure of Thucydides, an Athenian general and historian, developed the idea from the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta at the end of the 5th century BCE, a war in which he was personally involved. He even wrote a history of part of the war. Athens lost that war. There was a Western Mediterranean factor contributing to the defeat when the Athenians sent a disastrous military expedition to the Greek city of Syracuse in Sicily. In general, though, the Greek world, increasingly riven by its internal divisions, turned its attention away from the Western Med. Its deepening divisions undermined the authority of the Greek world and left it increasingly vulnerable. It took a major military leader, a young dynamic king who mounted the throne in Macedon, to turn Greek fortunes around. However, he too also turned its attention further away from the West. He was Alexander. His outstanding military successes eventually won him the title the Great. We tend to think of conquerors as great, although the people conquered might perhaps not share our enthusiasm. Alexander created a colossal empire in which Greek language and culture became dominant. A glance at the map, though, shows that its focus was firmly away from the Western Mediterranean. On the contrary, it extended southward into Egypt and a long, long way eastward to northwest India. As for the poor Phoenicians, well, not financially poor, but poor in the sense of unfortunate, they developed a regrettable tendency to be invaded on a regular basis. First, from the 9th to the late 7th century BCE, there were the Assyrians, or rather the Neo-Assyrians, that is, the New Assyrians. They were followed by the Babylonians from the late 7th to the mid-6th centuries, though they were Neo too. In both cases, we use the word Neo to distinguish them as the most recent versions of old empires. That, you might feel, was bad enough, but the Phoenicians' troubles weren't over. Babylonian rule was brought to an end by the Persians, specifically the Achaemenid ones, until the last third of the 4th century. At which point, who came knocking at the door but that very same Alexander that we like to think of as the Great? The Phoenician cities were absorbed into the new Greek Empire. Now, none of this killed the great cities such as Tyre and Sidon. They remained great trading centres and immensely wealthy. What they lost was the independence that would have allowed them to build and maintain their own empire. But, you may remember, there were Phoenicians outside Phoenicia. They included the citizens of the greatest Phoenician city outside the Middle East. These were the Carthaginians in what is now Tunisia, and they stepped into the gap. The daughter city, Carthage, took over from the parents in Phoenicia and replaced them as one of the superpowers of the Western Mediterranean region that included Iberia. Now there were Greeks outside Greece too. Syracuse in Sicily in particular was a major Greek centre, which eventually gave birth to one of the outstanding mathematicians and engineers of the classical world, Archimedes. Sadly for those Greek cities, however, they were mostly in southern Italy and Sicily, which meant they were far too close for comfort to the other new rising power. This was a cheeky upstart from an insignificant settlement in the middle of the Italian peninsula. When Athens was at the height of its power in the 5th century BCE, Rome was an obscure town, little more than a village, that few, if any, people had heard of. That, you don't need me to tell you, was about to change. In the 5th century BCE, Rome was still a relatively minor power. During the 4th century, on the other hand, it expanded rapidly and emerged as one of the leading states of central Italy. It had pretty serious ambitions. But I don't imagine anyone actually believed that it would become what it did eventually turn into, one of the great and mightiest of empires the world has seen. But it had serious ambitions all the same, initially at least, to become the dominant power of the Italian peninsula. It did this through a mixture of warfare and diplomacy. It compelled many of its neighbouring peoples to become allies. Unlike many ancient empires, Rome often incorporated defeated peoples into its political system, rather than simply ruling them as subjects. Its allies retained varying degrees of autonomy, but in practice it was Rome that held ultimate authority. The Greeks of southern Italy were no keener than other Italian peoples to be absorbed into the Roman sphere of influence. In 280 BCE, the Greek city of Taras, Tarentum to the Romans, Taranto today, appealed to Pyrrhus, the king of Epirus in northwestern Greece, for assistance against the Romans. He travelled across with an army and won some victories. But since he's given his name to the notion of a Pyrrhic victory, one in which the casualties are so heavy that it probably wasn't worth winning in the first place, you can doubtless imagine how massively his campaign ultimately failed. Eventually, the Greek cities of southern Italy were absorbed into the Roman sphere and incorporated into Rome's alliance system. In the long run, however, that often worked out well for them, since many of their descendants would eventually be admitted to Roman citizenship. Civis Romanus sum, I am a citizen of Rome, would become a declaration of pride and privilege. In fact, pride, privilege and protection, because the Romans did offer protection to their citizens, at least in principle. There'd be a curious and paradoxical effect to that, one that would be recognised by the 1st century Roman poet Horace. He wrote, "Conquered Greece, conquered her savage conqueror, and brought the arts to rustic Latium." Latium, in modern Italian Lazio, is the province which includes Rome. What Horace was saying is that the Romans conquered the Greeks militarily, but the Greeks conquered Rome culturally. There came a time when to be an intellectual, or simply cultured, a Roman had to know how to read and even to write Greek. By the early 3rd century BCE, the Romans had reached the first stage of their ambitious journey. They controlled most of the Italian peninsula, but they didn't have any of the major islands. That was highly annoying because the islands could be very valuable. It's odd to think of now, since Sicily is a relatively poor region of modern Italy, but back then it had the potential to be one of the main producers of grain for the peninsula, as it would in fact become in the not-too-distant future. I've already mentioned that there were Greek cities on the island. As well as the greatest of them, Syracuse, there were significant settlements at Messina, Naxos near Taormina, and Gela today. One of the saddest stories amongst those cities was that of Akragas, today's Agrigento. It was a Greek cultural centre and pretty prosperous until it was subjected to a cruel siege and ultimately sacked by Carthaginian forces at the end of the 5th century BCE. Most of the surviving population was driven out. It was repopulated later and remained Greek in culture, but it never fully recovered, and Carthage remained in control. Sadly, as we'll find out later, that wasn't even the end of its troubles. In the west of Sicily, there were some major Carthaginian centres. They included Panormus, which is now the capital of the island, Palermo. Soluntum, now Solunto, has some impressive Carthaginian and Roman ruins, as does Lilybaeum, now Marsala, home of an excellent sweet wine. And then there's Motia, now Mozia, an island off the western end of Sicily. It has a glorious seawater basin still known as the Coton, though that word means an artificial harbour, like the circular military harbour at Carthage. Excavations in the 2000s by a team led by the Italian archaeologist Lorenzo Nigro showed that the basin was too shallow to have been a harbour. Instead, his team argues that it was a sacred pool forming part of the surrounding temple complex. So that's the Sicilian scene set for the next act of its history in the early 3rd century BCE. That was when a group of mercenaries from Greek regions of Campania in southern Italy, who'd once fought for Syracuse but were now unemployed and hostile to their former employer, moved into the Syracusan city of Messana in the northeast of Sicily. It sits on what we now call the Strait of Messina, the narrowest point between the island of Sicily and the Italian mainland. Having been allowed in by the local population a little later, in 288 BCE, they showed their gratitude by massacring rather a lot of them and driving out most of the rest. They decided to call themselves after their god of war, Mammers, and set up a maritime statelet in the region around the city. They even struck coins, some of them showing a warrior, which is a pretty appropriate emblem for a bunch who found it as easy as they did to inflict brutal violence. When Syracuse moved against them in 265, they appealed first to the Carthaginians for help. Carthage sent troops to occupy Messana, ostensibly to protect it. Before long, however, the Mamertines decided a protective force that could quickly turn into an occupation wasn't to their taste. They issued a second call, this time to Rome. Rome needed no more. Whoever the Mamertines were, whatever their crimes, they offered a perfect pretext for Rome to take on Carthage in Sicily. That meant crossing the Strait of Messina. Rome had given itself a redoubtable army on land, but it had nothing to challenge the great maritime power that was Carthage. Both the Greeks and the Phoenicians, followed by the Carthaginians as successors of the Phoenicians, had made fortunes from building trading empires across the Mediterranean. Inevitably, that had given them great fleets, whether for trading or to provide a serious naval power, and Rome had nothing of the kind. That makes it something of a mystery to this day that the Romans were able to cross the Strait of Messina with very little trouble. Indeed, when they reached the other side, the commander of the Carthaginian forces there pulled out without a fight, and ancient accounts suggest he may have been paid for his failure by being crucified on his return home. It's possible that he felt that Messana was untenable after the Mamertines, who'd invited the Carthaginians in, turned against them. But the ease of the crossing, with the major naval power that was Carthage failing to block it, is harder to explain. The Roman crossing to Sicily in 264 BCE was the start of a bitter 23-year-long war. It came to be known as the First Punic War, where Punic just means Phoenician. You won't have missed that it was only the first. We have 2 more to come. Rome's army proved powerful, which gave it some stunning victories, such as at the siege of Acragas. As I mentioned before, the city was Greek in culture but under Carthaginian control. That led to the Roman siege. When the Romans captured the city, it yielded 25,000 captives they could sell into slavery. It was a good deal for Rome, which made some money from it. It was probably a good deal for the Roman soldiers and their allies, because the custom was that they got a cut. It was a deal which I imagine the people of Acragas appreciated rather less. Much of the time, however, there was a stalemate between the two sides. The Carthaginians had mostly coastal towns that could be resupplied by sea. That hadn't prevented the fall of Acragas, but it certainly made it harder, and it held up Rome's progress in conquering the entire island. To break the stalemate, Rome realized that it had to find a way to prevent the Carthaginians continuing to resupply their strongholds by sea. That meant that it had to turn itself into a naval power capable of confronting its enemy, and it had to do it fast. The shock for its enemy was that Rome was able to do so. The traditional story, as told by the Greek historian Polybius, is that Rome captured a grounded Carthaginian ship. It then set its carpenters to copy its design. That may well be true, but it's unlikely the Romans started from zero. Some of its Italian allies, and many of the Greek ones, were maritime states to be reckoned with themselves. There were, however, techniques that the Carthaginians had taken further than others. In particular, that included the use of what are known as mortise and tenon joints between planks, which produced ship hulls that were stronger and more watertight. The Romans called the technique the Punic joint and adopted it themselves. The Romans emerged with rather heavier ships than the Carthaginians, making them less quick in the water and less manoeuvrable. But they also developed a new military device for their ships that played to their strength, although at a very high price in seaworthiness. Naval tactics at the time were mostly based around ramming the enemy's ship. Bronze-tipped wooden rams extended forward from the prow, the front, of ships to do serious damage and potentially sink an enemy vessel. As it happened, however, ships had become far bigger. This was the age of the quinquereme. They had 3 banks of oars on each side, which may sound surprising given that the prefix quinque suggests 5. That all makes sense, however, when you consider that the top 2 banks had 2 rowers on each oar and the bottom bank 1, making 5 oarsmen for each of the 3 oars viewed vertically. The sheer size of these vessels made them hard to sink by ramming. They could absorb more damage than the previous generation of triremes. So naval tactics were evolving towards bringing a ship close to an enemy's and boarding it, sending armed men aboard to seize control. That's where the Romans' invention came into its own. It was called the corvus, Latin for crow. According to Polybius, it consisted of a wooden, pivotable arm supporting a wooden gangway with a sharp metal spike underneath it at its far end. It was fixed to a short mast around which it could swivel, set near the prow of the ship. When the arm was dropped onto an enemy vessel, the spike drove into the deck and prevented the enemy pulling away. The gangway was wide enough for 2 men abreast, and soldiers could charge across it and onto the enemy ship. That turned a naval engagement into an infantry one, and that was what the Romans excelled at. There was, however, a downside. Polybius describes the gangway as being 4 feet wide, 1.2 metres, and 36 feet long, 10.9 metres. The mast around which it was designed to swivel was, he says, 24 feet, 7.3 metres, high and 9 inches, 23 centimetres in diameter. That would be a hell of a weight to add to the forepart of a ship, and it would make it highly unstable in a storm. This has led many archaeologists to wonder whether Polybius exaggerated the size of the corvus. Indeed, back in 1907, the archaeologist William Tarn argued that the corvus was quite simply impossible. He felt that Polybius, writing quite a time later, had misinterpreted the information he was working from. Most archaeologists would not subscribe to Tarn's view, though they accept that the corvus might not have been quite as large as Polybius suggested. What appears likely is that the corvus contributed to the poor seaworthiness of the early and heavy Roman quinquiremes. It seems fairly well established that Rome lost a great many more ships to storms that can blow up suddenly and become severe in the Mediterranean than it did to Carthaginian naval action. The archaeologist Adrian Goldsworthy estimates that Rome lost some 770 ships during the First Punic War, but only 200 of them in combat. In part that was down to inexperienced naval officers not knowing how to deal with storms effectively. The lack of seaworthiness of early Roman ship design, however, can't have helped. And having the weight of the corvus on the prow of the ship must have made a bad situation still worse. The Romans themselves must have been aware of that, because by the end of the war, with 23 years of naval experience behind them, they dropped the use of the corvus entirely. In any case, whatever the difficulties, the Romans proved themselves capable of rising to the challenge. They soldiered on and eventually, in 241 BCE, defeated Carthage. That gave them control of Sicily, and Carthage's problems only got worse from there. They'd used a great many mercenary soldiers. Mercenaries are loyal to their employers just as long as those employers continue to pay them what they regard as an adequate salary for fighting. We also saw from what happened at Acragas that a cut of loot was a significant contributor to soldiers' earnings. But you only get loot if you defeat your enemies, and the Carthaginians had been defeated themselves. They had no loot to share with the mercenaries, and indeed they couldn't even pay them the arrears that were due to them. We saw before how the mercenaries that had been fighting for Syracuse in Sicily rose against them and occupied Messana, declaring themselves the Maritime Republic. Now the Carthaginian mercenaries mutinied too. They were joined by some of the African subjects of Carthage who rose in revolt. Rome stayed neutral. It had, after all, just ended one war and felt in no condition to start another. So even when Carthaginian mercenaries rose on the island of Sardinia and asked for Roman protection, Rome at first refused. But at the end of the war, when the mutineers had actually been kicked out of Sardinia by the local people, Rome changed its mind and sent a force into Sardinia, ostensibly to support the rebels, but in reality to take control of both Sardinia and Corsica. The two islands had previously been Carthaginian possessions, and their occupation by Rome was a clear breach of the peace treaty that had ended the First Punic War. Carthage responded by deciding it was time to extend its imperial possessions on land. And where did it turn its attention? Why, to Iberia. Two new superpowers now dominated the Western Mediterranean. They were competitors, they were hostile towards each other. Between them there was only an unstable peace which could degenerate any time into a new outbreak of war. They were now going to turn their attention to Iberia. The people there had no part in their original quarrel, but they were about to discover that that was no protection against being involved in a superpower conflict. That's where we'll pick up the story next week. Until then, many thanks for listening.